Why did Paul appeal to Caesar before Festus? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Acts on walking through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing Acts chapter 25, verses 1 to 12. But before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to Acts chapter 25, verse 1. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Acts chapter 25, beginning at verse 1. Now when Festus had come to the province, after 3 days he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and the chief men of the Jews informed him against Paul, and they petitioned him, asking a favor against him, that he would summon him to Jerusalem, while they lay in ambush along the road to kill him. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself was going there shortly. Therefore, he said, "Let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man, to see if there is any fault in him." And when he had remained among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. And the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. When he had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul, which they could not prove, while he answered for himself, "Neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all." But Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things?" So Paul said, "I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you know very well. For if I am an offender or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there is nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar." Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, "You have appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you shall go." Festus is now procurator or governor of Judea, with Felix, the governor, when Paul was arrested, being recalled to Rome. When Festus arrived in Palestine, instead of going to his home in Caesarea and settling in right away, he chose to go from there to Jerusalem 3 days after his arrival. Now, why would he do this? Because this is where the power center in Judea was. And so if the Roman governor was to succeed in governing the region, he must meet with the leaders of Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin, and become known among them. This meeting gave the high priest, who by then was a different man, and the chief men among the Jews, an opportunity to try and use Festus's recent arrival, and perhaps his unfamiliarity with the politics and goings-on in the region, against him. They did this by informing him of the charges that had been made against Paul, but that Felix had yet to make a ruling on. They desired that Festus approve that Paul should be summoned to Jerusalem so that final judgment could be rendered. Now this, of course, was disingenuous, for their real plan was to ambush the troops who were transporting Paul from Caesarea to Jerusalem and kill Paul along the way, something they had failed to do 2 years earlier when Lysias secretly transported Paul from Jerusalem to Caesarea. Porcius Festus, though, unlike his predecessor Felix, seemed to be more just and not prone to flattery or bribery, and thus he was not going to be manipulated to do anything. Paul was being held at Caesarea, and had been held there for 2 years, so why move him? If the Jews wanted to accuse the man and find fault in him, they should travel the short distance to Caesarea to do so. Having determined the proper course for this matter, Festus remained in Jerusalem for 10 more days, getting to know the rulers in Palestine before returning to Caesarea. But unlike Felix, who is predisposed to procrastination, Festus wanted this matter concerning Paul concluded. So the next day Paul was brought before Festus, who sat on the judgment seat. The Jews from Jerusalem also came and leveled their charges against Paul, these charges being many of the same charges they levied before Felix, but charges they couldn't prove. The people who had caused the riot in the temple 2 years earlier over Paul supposedly bringing a Gentile into the temple, well, where were they? Well, they were Jews from Asia who weren't present in Palestine anymore. What about Paul being a ringleader of the sect of Nazarenes and sowing discord among the Jews in Judea? Well, Paul's been in prison for 2 years, and yet there has been no unrest. If Paul was a ringleader, don't you think that even from prison he could have orchestrated something, especially since Felix let him see his friends? And what about Paul stirring up division among the Jews around the world? That was not Festus's jurisdiction, and even if it was, their testimony was hearsay. This lack of evidence Paul pointed to in his defense, saying that he has neither done anything against the law of the Jews or the law of the Romans. He has not done anything in the temple that would have defiled it. He should therefore be released. However, Festus was new to the area. Tensions between the Jews and the Romans were increasing steadily through the years, and the Jewish revolt was only about 6 years away by this point. That revolt wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing, but a result of years of pent-up anger by the Jews against the Romans. Therefore, as a new ruler, Festus thought it prudent to set before Paul a compromise. Go up to Jerusalem and allow the Jews to judge you concerning these things, for after all, these are matters concerning Jewish law, not Roman law. Paul was no dummy, though. He knew what Festus was doing. He was passing the buck in order to keep the peace. Paul rightly said that he stood before Caesar's judgment seat. He should be judged there by Festus. He told Festus that he knew that Paul had done nothing wrong to the Jews, so why then would it be right to be tried before them? He goes on to say that he is not seeking to be released as a guilty person on some technicality. If he was guilty, he would accept the consequences, even if that was death. But he was not guilty, and so if Festus couldn't give him justice, then he was going to use his right afforded as a Roman citizen, which was that he would appeal to Caesar directly. In doing this, I believe Paul also knew something that Festus might not have yet, since he had just arrived in Palestine, which was that under no circumstance was he going to get a fair trial in Jerusalem. The men Festus was dealing with there were not sincere. They wanted to kill Paul no matter what. And so by appealing to Caesar, not only was Paul seeking justice, he was also ensuring that he survived to be able to continue to preach, and he was ensuring that Festus be saved from looking like a fool for trusting the Jewish leaders. Once a citizen appealed to Rome, that request had to be granted, and so Festus said that he would send Paul to Caesar. However, he wouldn't do so right away, for there is an intervening story that Luke records for us here, a story we will begin to look at, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Acts chapter 25, verses 13 to 27, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.